I'm
He
truly sorry to
froze
tell
in
you
the
this, but we've
hospital
reached a point where
hallway
we've
when the
exhausted
doctor
all
said, "Your
options.
child
There's nothing
isn't
more we can
sick,
do."
but this can't continue." It wasn't an illness they were talking about, and that terrified him more than any diagnosis ever could. His son sat across the room, silent, hands clenched, eyes fixed on the floor, as if disappearing might solve everything. In that moment, the single father realized something devastating. He had been protecting his child so fiercely that he had taught him how to be afraid of living. And that truth hit harder than the day he became a widower. He never planned to raise a child alone, and he certainly never imagined that love could turn into a quiet form of fear. After his wife died following a long illness, life became a careful routine built around survival rather than hope. He worked, he cooked, he showed up to every appointment, every school meeting, every sleepless night. From the outside, he looked like a devoted single dad doing everything right. But inside, he was exhausted, emotionally numb, and terrified of losing the one person he had left. His child sensed it long before anyone else did. The anxiety, the silence, the reluctance to face the world were not random. They were learned. Children don't just listen to what we say, they absorb how we live. And this father was teaching his child that safety meant avoidance and love meant constant vigilance. When circumstances forced him into a space where he could no longer hide, where other parents spoke openly about fear, grief, and failure, something began to crack. For the first time, he was no longer the strong one in the room. He was just a man who had never allowed himself to grieve properly. This story is not about romance arriving to save a broken man. It is about a single father confronting the quiet damage of unresolved grief. It is about realizing that being present is not the same as being alive. And most of all, it is about the painful understanding that healing your child sometimes begins with admitting how deeply you are still hurting yourself. The doctor's words echoed long after the hallway emptied. "Your child isn't sick," she had said gently, hands folded in front of her clipboard. "But this level of anxiety can't continue without consequences." He nodded like he understood, like this was something he could fix with medication or routines or stricter bedtime rules. But deep down, he knew this was different. There was no prescription for what sat heavy in his chest as he watched his son curl inward on the plastic hospital chair, shoulders tense, eyes locked on the scuffed linoleum floor. This wasn't a virus. This was learned fear. 3 years earlier, he had stood in a very different hospital hallway, holding his wife's hand while machines breathed for her. Cancer didn't arrive loudly. It crept in, quietly rearranging their lives until every plan revolved around scans, treatments, and whispered hope. By the time she died, exhaustion had replaced grief. There were no dramatic goodbyes, just a slow unraveling and the hollow shock of waking up one morning and realizing she was gone. Suddenly, he was a single dad. At first, survival became his religion. He learned how to pack lunches, how to braid hair badly and pretend it was fine, how to read bedtime stories with a steady voice while his heart cracked open. He showed up every single day. Teachers praised him, doctors admired his dedication. Friends said, "Your kid is lucky to have you." And he believed them, because believing that meant he didn't have to look too closely at what he was becoming. He built his life around control, schedules, safety plans, backup plans for the backup plans. If his son hesitated before school, he let him stay home. If crowds overwhelmed him, they avoided them. If questions about his mother came too close to tears, he changed the subject. Pain was treated like something contagious, something to contain, not confront. At night, after his son fell asleep, he sat alone in the quiet living room, scrolling through old photos he couldn't bring himself to delete. He told himself this was normal, that grief had no timeline, that one day things would loosen their grip on him. But years passed, and instead of easing, his fear sharpened. He wasn't afraid of being alone anymore. He was afraid of living fully and losing it all again. That fear bled into everything. His son stopped speaking in class. He clung to him in public, fingers tight around his jacket. Doctors use words like separation, anxiety, and avoidant behavior. And still, the father told himself he was doing the right thing because protecting his child felt like the only promise he hadn't broken. The morning everything shifted didn't feel dramatic. It was ordinary, too ordinary to warn him. His son refused to get out of the car for school, breathing shallow, eyes wide, tears silent. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Other parents walked past with backpacks and coffee cups, glancing briefly before looking away. "I can't," his son whispered. "Please don't make me." The father did what he always did. He drove away. Later that afternoon, the school counselor called. Again. This time, she didn't talk about accommodations or patients. She talked about intervention, group programs, support circles, words that sounded optional until she said, "If nothing changes, this will get worse." That's how he found himself sitting in a community center classroom one Thursday evening, surrounded by other parents who looked just as tired as he felt. No one here was polished. No one pretended to have answers. Some cried openly. Some stared at the floor like their children did. For the first time since his wife died, he wasn't the strongest person in the room. He listened as a mother talked about her daughter's panic attacks. A father admitted he was afraid his grief had made him emotionally absent. Each story chipped away at the careful wall he had built around himself. Then the facilitator asked a question that made his throat close. "What are you afraid would happen if you stopped controlling everything?" He didn't raise his hand, he didn't speak, but the answer hit him anyway. "I'm afraid my child will see how broken I am. I'm afraid he'll learn that loving deeply means losing everything." On the drive home, his son slept in the back seat, curled into himself the way he always did. The streetlights blurred past, and for the first time, the father wondered whether the life he had built, safe, quiet, controlled, was slowly suffocating both of them. He thought about the doctor's words, about the counselor's tone, about the truth he'd been avoiding. He had survived his wife's death by shrinking his world, but his son was growing inside that shrinking space. That night, after tucking his child into bed, he stayed longer than usual, watched the rise and fall of his chest, the softness of his face in sleep. "The trust. I'm trying so hard," he whispered into the quiet room, unsure who he was talking to anymore. For the first time, the question wasn't how to protect his child. It was whether he was brave enough to change. The room smelled faintly of coffee and dry erase markers. He took the same chair every Thursday evening, close to the door, instinctively choosing the easiest escape. Old habits died hard. The first few sessions of the parent support group had been mostly silent for him. He listened. He nodded when appropriate. He left the moment the clock allowed. Participation felt dangerous. It was during the fourth week that he noticed her. She wasn't sitting with the parents. She stood near the whiteboard, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back in a way that suggested practicality over style. She didn't speak much at first, just listened, occasionally jotting something down. When she did speak, it wasn't in the rehearsed tone he expected from professionals. She didn't offer comfort. She asked questions, not soft ones, honest ones. What happens after you leave the room? Who are you when your child isn't watching? What are you teaching without realizing it? He felt those questions land in his chest like stones. Her name was Claire. She wasn't a therapist. She explained later she was a behavioral educator who worked with families dealing with trauma and anxiety. Her role wasn't to fix anyone. It was to observe patterns and disrupt the ones that were quietly doing harm. He didn't like her immediately. She made him uncomfortable in a way that felt personal, even though she barely looked at him directly. When parents spoke about fear, she didn't rush to reassure them. She let the silence stretch, let the truth breathe. One evening, after a father across the circle admitted he slept on his daughter's bedroom floor because she couldn't fall asleep without him, Claire asked calmly, "How old is she?" 10, the man said. The room went quiet. Claire nodded slowly. "And how long do you think she'll need you there before she learns she can't sleep without you?" The man stared at the floor. The father sitting near the door felt his throat tighten. He knew that floor. He knew that fear. After the session ended, he lingered longer than usual, pretending to check his phone. Claire gathered her things methodically. When she finally looked up, her eyes met his without hesitation. "You always sit closest to the exit," she said, not unkindly. He blinked. "Habit." "From what?" He almost laughed, almost. "Life." She considered him for a moment, then nodded. "That makes sense." She didn't push. That unsettled him more than if she had. Over the next few weeks, he found himself paying attention in ways he hadn't intended. Claire noticed things others missed. She spoke to children with respect, never condescension. When parents described their kids as fragile, she reframed gently. "They're adaptive," she would say. They learned what the world required. One evening, his son joined him for a parallel children's group down the hall. He watched from a distance as Claire knelt to speak to a boy who refused to join the activity. She didn't coax. She didn't bribe. She simply said, "You don't have to join yet, but you do have to stay." Something about that stuck with him. On the drive home, his son was unusually quiet, not anxious, just thoughtful. "She didn't make me talk," he said finally. "No," the father replied. "She just waited." The next session, Claire spoke directly to the parents. "Most of you are doing what you think is best," she said, "but intention doesn't cancel impact. Children don't need perfect parents. They need parents who are willing to be honest about fear." The word honesty hit him harder than fear ever had. After the group dispersed, Claire approached him. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He tensed automatically. "Sure." "Your son's anxiety, has it changed at all since you joined?" He hesitated. "Not really." "And what have you changed?" The question felt unfair. He did everything. He showed up. He rearranged his life. "I'm here," he said defensively. She didn't argue. "I know, but are you different?" The silence stretched between them. Finally, he exhaled. "No." Claire nodded as if he'd given the right answer. "That's usually where it starts," she said. He expected her to offer a solution, a plan, something actionable. Instead, she said, "Your child doesn't need you to be fearless. He needs to see you face fear." That night, he lay awake replaying her words. His wife's illness had taught him to anticipate loss, to brace for impact at all times. He had confused love with vigilance, safety with stillness. And now here was this woman, not offering comfort, not promising outcomes, just holding up a mirror he hadn't wanted to look into. The shift came subtly. He stopped answering every question for his son. He let silence exist without rushing to fill it. He resisted the urge to step in immediately when discomfort appeared. It felt wrong, like neglect, like danger. One evening, as they stood outside the classroom, his son hesitated at the door. The familiar tightening in his chest surged. "I can't," his son whispered. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene. Instead, he remembered Claire's words. "You don't have to join yet, but you do have to stay." "I'll be right here," he said quietly. "But you're going in." His son looked terrified, angry, betrayed. Then slowly, he took a step forward. It wasn't a victory, but it was movement. Later that night, Claire approached him again. "You didn't rescue him," she said. "That was hard for you." He nodded. His hands were still shaking. "You're not failing him," she continued. "You're teaching him that fear doesn't mean stop." He swallowed hard. "What if I mess this up?" She met his eyes fully this time. "You already have. That's parenting. The question is whether you're willing to keep going anyway." For the first time since his wife died, he felt something shift. Not relief, not hope exactly, but the uncomfortable sensation of possibility. He didn't know what this relationship with Claire was. It wasn't friendship, it wasn't romance, it was confrontation. And for the first time, he suspected that might be exactly what both he and his son needed. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon, right as he was finishing a meeting he barely remembered agreeing to attend. The school counselor's voice was calm, practiced, and carefully neutral. That alone made his stomach drop. "There was an incident today," she said. "Your son is physically safe, but emotionally, we need to talk." By the time he reached the school, his hands were shaking so badly he had to sit in the car for a full minute before opening the door. The hallway felt too bright, too loud, too alive. Every step echoed like an accusation. He found his son curled up in the counselor's office, knees pulled to his chest, eyes swollen and unfocused. He wasn't crying. That scared him more than tears ever could. "What happened?" the father asked, his voice too tight. The counselor explained gently, a group activity, a presentation, a moment when attention turned toward his son, when all eyes landed at once. The panic attack had come fast and hard. Shortness of breath, shaking, the overwhelming certainty that something terrible was about to happen. He kept saying he needed to leave, she said, that he couldn't stay, that it wasn't safe. The words hit him like a punch to the chest. Not safe. That was his language, his rules, his legacy. On the drive home, his son stared out the window in silence. The father wanted to apologize, to promise that nothing like this would ever happen again. He wanted to say they could pull him out of school, find another solution, build smaller walls. Instead, he said nothing. That night, after his son fell asleep, he sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the same spot for so long, the overhead light flickered automatically. Claire's words from weeks earlier looped through his mind. "What are you teaching?" without realizing it. The truth surfaced slowly, cruel in its clarity. He had taught his son that fear was a signal to retreat, that discomfort meant danger, that the world was something to endure, not engage, and worse, he had taught him that grief never really ends, it just gets quieter. The next support group session arrived too soon. He almost didn't go. Every instinct told him to stay home, to cancel, to handle this privately. But something in him, something raw and exhausted, pushed him out the door. When he arrived, Claire noticed immediately. "You look different," she said quietly. "I think I broke him," he replied just as quietly. She didn't argue. She didn't soften the moment. She waited. After the session, when the room had emptied and the chairs were stacked, he stayed behind. His hands were clenched so tightly, his fingers ached. "He had a panic attack today," he said. "At school." Claire nodded. "That happens." "No," he snapped, the edge in his voice surprising even him. "This is my fault." She didn't flinch. "Tell me why you think that," she said. He laughed bitterly. "Because I never let him see me fall apart. Because I never let him see me move on. Because I taught him that the safest place is small and quiet and controlled." The words spilled out faster now. "I watched my wife die for 2 years. He continued. "I watched her disappear piece by piece, and I promised myself I'd never let that kind of pain touch him. Ever." Claire listened, arms crossed loosely, eyes steady. "And what did that cost you?" she asked. He hesitated. "What did it cost him?" she corrected. The question broke something open. Tears came suddenly, violently. He bent forward, elbows on his knees, face in his hands. He hadn't cried like this since the funeral. Not the controlled grief of early mornings and empty beds, but the kind that stole breath and made his chest ache. "I don't know how to live without bracing for loss," he said. "I don't know how to teach him something I've never figured out myself." Claire sat down across from him. "Your son isn't broken," she said. "He's responding exactly the way a child does when he learns that love is fragile and the world is dangerous." He looked up, eyes red. "So what do I do?" She didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, "You stop pretending you're okay." The words felt almost offensive. "I can't fall apart," he said. I'm all he has." "No," she replied calmly. "You're all he sees. And right now what he sees is a man who survived by shutting down." She leaned forward slightly. "Children don't need parents who are unbreakable. They need parents who break and repair, who feel and recover, who show them that pain doesn't end everything." He shook his head. "If I open that door, I don't know if I can close it." "That's the risk," she said. "But staying closed is already hurting both of you." The breaking point came sooner than he expected. 2 nights later, his son woke him from a nightmare so intense he was shaking. This time, the father didn't rush to calm him, didn't offer reassurance or distractions. He sat on the edge of the bed, heart pounding. "What are you scared of?" he asked softly. His son hesitated, then barely audible. "I'm scared you'll disappear too." The words shattered him. Without thinking, he pulled his son into his arms and held him, both of them shaking now. "I'm scared too," he admitted. His son pulled back, startled. "You are?" "Yes," he said, voice breaking. "I'm scared all the time. I just didn't want you to know." They sat like that for a long time. No solutions, no fixing, just truth. The next morning, when his son hesitated at the school door, the fear was still there, but something was different. "I'll be scared," his son said. "I know," the father replied, "and I'll be scared too." The door closed behind him. Later that day, Claire received a text she hadn't expected. "Thank you for not saving me." She stared at the message for a long moment before replying. "That's not my job," she typed. "It never was." For the first time, the father understood that healing wasn't about erasing fear. It was about standing in it, together. Change did not arrive gently. It never does when it's real. For a few weeks after that night, things looked better on the surface. His son went to school more often. He spoke more at home. There were fewer tears, fewer moments of panic that sent the father's heart racing. Everyone told him this meant progress. But fear doesn't disappear just because it's acknowledged. Sometimes it gets quieter, more strategic. The call came from the school again, this time not from the counselor, but from the principal. "There's been a concern raised," she said carefully. "We think it would be best if you came in." He felt that old familiar tightening in his chest, the reflex to brace for impact. When he arrived, his son wasn't in the office. "He left campus," the principal explained. "He didn't run, he didn't panic, he just walked out." The words didn't make sense at first. "Walked out?" the father repeated. "Yes," she said, "during recess. He told the aide he needed to go home." Something cold spread through his body. They found his son 2 blocks away, sitting on the steps of an empty church, knees pulled up, backpack clutched to his chest. He looked small, too small to be carrying choices this heavy. The father dropped to his knees in front of him, relief and terror colliding violently. "What were you thinking?" he asked, voice shaking. His son looked up, eyes clear but distant. "I knew you'd come." That sentence stayed with him longer than any scream could have. That night, after his son fell asleep, the father didn't sit in the living room. He didn't scroll through photos or stare at walls. He went outside. The porch light buzzed softly as he sat on the steps, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. The truth settled in slowly, like something he'd been avoiding naming. His son wasn't just afraid. He was testing whether safety only existed within arm's reach. The next session at the community center felt heavier than all the ones before. The father arrived early and waited. When Claire walked in, she took one look at him and stopped. "What happened?" she asked. He told her everything. He didn't minimize it, didn't explain it away. He spoke like a man finally out of excuses. When he finished, Claire was quiet for a long time. "This is the moment most parents choose comfort over growth," she said finally. He looked at her sharply. "Are you saying I should punish him?" "No," she replied. "I'm saying you need to stop being the place he hides and start being the place he launches from." The words felt impossible. "He could have gotten hurt," the father said. "He could have disappeared." "Yes," Claire said gently, "and right now, he's disappearing anyway, just more slowly." That was when the real fear surfaced. not of losing his child physically, but of raising a child who never learned how to stay. The breaking point came days later. His son refused to get out of bed, not crying, not panicking, just refusing. "I'm not going," he said flatly. The father sat on the edge of the bed, heart pounding. "Talk to me." "I don't want to be brave," his son said. "I just want you." The words cut deeper than anger ever could. For a moment, just a moment, he considered giving in, calling the school, staying home, wrapping his life around this fragile orbit forever. Then he saw it. Not fear in his son's eyes, expectation, the belief that love meant retreat. Something inside him hardened, not against his child, but against the pattern that had ruled both their lives. He took a breath. "I love you," he said, "and I'm not keeping you small so I don't feel scared." His son stared at him, stunned. "You can be afraid," the father continued, voice steady but raw, "but you're going, and I'm not rescuing you from it." Tears came fast, anger, words thrown like weapons. "You don't care anymore." The accusation nearly broke him, but he stayed. That afternoon, the school called again, this time not with concern, but with observation. He stayed, the counselor said. It was hard, but he stayed. That night, Claire texted him. "This part doesn't feel like healing, does it?" he replied after a long pause. "No, it feels like losing him." Her response came quickly. "It feels that way because you're losing the version of him that only existed in fear." The true test came weeks later. His son had been invited to participate in a small class presentation. Optional, no pressure. The old version of him would have declined immediately. This time the father said yes. The morning of the presentation, his son vomited from nerves. "I can't do this," he whispered. The father cleaned him up, heart pounding, hands steady. "I know," he said, "and you're still going." At the classroom door, his son froze. The teacher waited. The other children waited. Every instinct screamed to intervene. Instead, the father knelt and whispered, "I'm not leaving." "I don't want to be like you," his son blurted suddenly. The words stunned him. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I don't want to be scared all the time," his son said through tears. Something in the father broke open. "Then you have to do this," he said softly. "And so do I." The door closed behind his son. Minutes passed like hours. When the door opened again, his son walked out slowly, eyes red, face pale, but upright. He didn't smile, but he didn't collapse either. That night, as they sat at the kitchen table eating quietly, his son looked up and said, "You were scared today too." "Yes," the father admitted. "But you stayed." "Yes," his son nodded, as if filing that information somewhere important. The realization came then, sharp and undeniable. He hadn't almost lost his son by pushing too hard. He had almost lost him by refusing to let go. This wasn't about school or anxiety or grief. It was about choosing to live visibly, even when it hurt. Later that night, he texted Claire, "I think I finally understand what you meant." Her reply came a moment later. "Good. Because this is where it actually begins." The change didn't announce itself. There was no moment where everything suddenly felt easy, no clear line separating before and after. Healing, he learned, wasn't a destination. It was a pattern, one you chose again and again, especially on the days it felt pointless. Mornings were still hard. Some days his son woke up ready. Other days he moved slowly, eyes distant, hands fidgeting at the hem of his shirt. The fear didn't vanish. It softened. It learned to coexist with movement. And the father learned something too. He learned that being present didn't mean hovering, that love didn't require constant protection, that staying meant allowing discomfort to exist without immediately trying to erase it. Claire remained part of their lives, though not in the way people expected. She didn't step into their home or insert herself into their routines. She didn't promise permanence or blur boundaries. She stayed exactly where she had always been, just close enough to notice when he started slipping back into old patterns. There were moments when he wished she would tell him what to do, when he wanted certainty instead of questions. But she never offered it. Instead, she would ask things like, "What are you afraid of right now?" Or, "Is this for him or is this for you?" At first, the questions irritated him. Later, they steadied him. One evening, after a particularly hard day, his son sat at the kitchen table long after dinner, drawing quietly. The father watched him from across the room, noticing how his shoulders no longer curled inward the way they used to. "Do you think Mom would be proud of me?" his son asked suddenly. The question hit him unexpectedly. "I think she would," the father said honestly, "and I think she'd be proud of you too." His son nodded, then hesitated. "Do you think she'd be proud of you?" The old instinct to deflect, to joke, to move past it rose up immediately. This time he stayed. "I think she'd be proud that I'm trying," he said. That night, after his son went to bed, he sat alone with that word. Trying. It wasn't heroic, it wasn't impressive, but it was honest. Weeks passed, then months. School became manageable. Not easy, but navigable. His son began to raise his hand occasionally. He still hesitated, still stumbled, but he no longer fled at the first sign of fear. And the father noticed something else changing. He laughed more. Not the careful kind, the kind that comes from relief, but real laughter that surprised him mid-sentence. He started making plans again, small ones at first. A weekend hike, a movie night with friends, life expanding inch by inch. One afternoon after a session, Claire walked with him to the parking lot. "You're different," she said. He smiled faintly. "So is he." She nodded. "You stop making fear the center of your decisions." He thought about that. "I still feel it." "Of course you do," she said. "You just don't let it decide everything anymore." There was a pause. "People keep asking if we're—" he started, then stopped. Claire smiled knowingly. "If we're what?" "Something more." She considered him for a moment. "Are we?" she asked. He exhaled slowly. "I don't know." "That's okay," she said. "Not everything needs a label." And she was right. What they had wasn't a love story shaped by rescue or dependency. It wasn't built on filling each other's voids. It was grounded, deliberate, and honest. A connection formed through shared truth rather than shared escape. At home, his son noticed too. "You like her," he said one night matter-of-factly. The father smiled. "I do. But you don't need her," his son added. The statement surprised him. "No," the father said softly. "I don't." His son nodded, satisfied. "That's good." It was, because for the first time the father understood that what his child needed most wasn't a parent who revolved around him, but one who stood beside him. The final shift came quietly, on an ordinary morning. They stood at the front door, shoes on, backpacks ready. His son hesitated just for a second. "I'm nervous," he said. The father nodded. "Me too." His son looked up at him. "But we're still going." "Yes," the father said, "and we're still going." The door closed behind them. Later that evening, after his son fell asleep, the father sat on the couch, the house quiet around him. He thought about the man he had been, the one who believed love meant constant vigilance, who mistook fear for responsibility. He hadn't failed because he was broken. He had failed because he was human. And now he was learning something harder than survival. He was learning how to live. Not recklessly, not without fear, but openly. And that, he realized, was the greatest lesson he could ever pass on to his child. There was no final moment where everything locked neatly into place. No dramatic declaration. No promise that fear would never return. Instead, there was a quiet understanding that settled into the spaces where panic used to live. The father noticed it in the smallest details, the way his son no longer scanned every room for exits, the way silence no longer felt like an emergency that needed fixing. Fear still existed, but it no longer dictated their lives. The father learned that courage didn't always look like confidence. Sometimes it looked like showing up when every part of you wanted to retreat. Sometimes it looked like letting your child struggle without rushing in to save them. even when your hands trembled and your chest ached with the urge to intervene. He also learned something far more uncomfortable, that grief doesn't disappear just because time passes. It transforms only when it's acknowledged. For years, he had believed that being strong meant never letting his child see him falter. That strength was synonymous with emotional silence. But what his son needed wasn't a flawless protector. It was a human being who could model what it meant to fall and recover. In allowing himself to be seen, afraid, uncertain, still healing, the father gave his son something no reassurance ever could: permission to feel without shame. There were still difficult days, days when anxiety resurfaced without warning, days when the father questioned every choice he made. But there was also a growing sense of trust, not in the absence of pain, but in their ability to move through it together. And that changed everything, because staying, truly staying, meant resisting the urge to numb, to distract, to escape. It meant choosing presence over protection, honesty over control. It meant understanding that love is not measured by how much fear you prevent, but by how much truth you're willing to hold. The father stopped asking himself when things would finally be normal. He realized that normal had never been the goal. Connection was, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, life began to feel larger again. One evening, long after the house had grown quiet, the father sat alone and thought about the lessons he had never meant to teach. He had taught his son that the world was fragile, that love could vanish without warning, that safety meant shrinking. None of those lessons were spoken out loud. They were absorbed through behavior, through choices made out of fear rather than intention. And now he was teaching something different. He was teaching that fear could exist without being obeyed, that pain could be acknowledged without becoming identity, that living fully always carried risk, and that risk was not something to be ashamed of. Children, he realized, don't learn resilience from speeches or reassurance. They learn it by watching how the adults they trust respond to uncertainty. They learn it when fear is met with honesty instead of avoidance. His son was still sensitive, still thoughtful, still deeply aware of the world around him. But those qualities were no longer treated as weaknesses to be managed. They were strengths to be guided. The father began to understand that his role was not to eliminate discomfort, but to walk beside his child as he learned to navigate it. That shift didn't just change his son, it changed him. He allowed himself to imagine a future again, not a perfect one, not a guaranteed one, but a real one. One that included joy alongside loss, hope alongside grief. One that didn't require him to be emotionally invisible in order to survive. And perhaps most importantly, he forgave himself for the years spent in survival mode, for the mistakes born out of love and fear tangled together, for not knowing then what he knows now. Parenthood, he learned, is not about getting it right the first time. It's about being willing to evolve when the cost of staying the same becomes too high. And that willingness to reflect, to change, to stay present became the quiet foundation of their family. This story is not about a man who conquered grief or eliminated fear. It is about a single father who learned that avoiding pain does not protect the people you love, it teaches them how to hide. It is about understanding that children do not need parents who are fearless. They need parents who are honest. Parents who are brave enough to live visibly, even when it's uncomfortable. If you are a parent reading this, especially a single parent, know this: your child is not asking you to be perfect. They are asking you to be real. They are watching how you respond to loss, to uncertainty, to fear. They are learning what love looks like by how you live, not just by what you say. And if you have ever felt that you had to stay small, numb, or closed off in order to survive, this story is for you too. Healing does not begin when fear disappears. It begins when fear no longer makes your decisions. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop protecting yourself from life and start participating in it again. Because staying emotionally, honestly, and perfectly is the most powerful form of love there is. And for one father and one child, that choice made all the difference.